Okay, well, we're over 60 now, and so in the interest of everyone's time, most importantly yours, Dr. Batool, I think we can go ahead and get started, which is really exciting. So I will move us along to the next slide, and welcome everyone to the webinar. I want to start the way we always do at the Tahirih Justice Center, which is to remind folks to take care of yourself first. This is some pretty groundbreaking research. It might include some information folks haven't heard before. It's also a topic that might bring up, personal things for folks, whether it's your family, yourself, the clients that you serve. And so if at any point you're uncomfortable or are feeling anxious by anything that's being shared, please feel free to step away. You can pause. We will also be sending out a recording of this after the fact. So if you need time to sort of go at your own pace with this material, please always feel free to do so. We encourage folks to always take care of themselves first and foremost. And first, before we sort of dive into our content, I also just wanted to make sure everyone is aware of who we are. Who is the Tahirih Justice Center? What do we do? And why are we so excited to be hosting Dr. Batool today? So the Tahirih Justice Center is a national nonprofit organization that provides free immigration legal services to survivors of gender-based violence. Our wraparound services also include social services, family law, and other forms of advocacy. And it's really sort of a holistic wraparound service model for our clients in the Washington, D.C. area, Baltimore, Maryland, Atlanta, Georgia, Houston, Texas, and San Francisco, California. And in particular, the project that Jalitz Villegas, who is another colleague of mine who's on with us today, currently manages is the project called the Forced Marriage Initiative. And it is the Forced Marriage Initiative that is hosting this webinar today. And we engage in direct services nationally, provide technical assistance across the country, and do research and outreach and education, much like we're doing today, on the issue of forced marriage and how it's showing up in communities across the United States. And so I've put, Tahirih's website is down there in the lower left-hand corner, but so is our standalone Forced Marriage Initiative website, preventforcedmarriage.org, where you can find tons of resources and also where you can route individuals at risk and survivors for more information that they can use to self-help and educate and reach out for services if they need. And fmi@tahirih.org is our direct email address if you ever want to be in touch. With that, I'll just do a little bit of like the classic webinar Administrivia, though we're all probably used to it now in February 2022. I just want to preview for folks that we are going to be together with Dr. Batool for a full hour and 30 minutes. There are not going to be breaks. So if you need to grab water, grab tea, grab coffee, or use the restroom before we dive in, please do, because we're going to just go straight through to 2:30 from here. We are going to be using the chat function. Dr. Batool does have some questions for folks to respond to throughout the presentation. So please make sure that you're able to use the chat right now. It should be on your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen with a little white triangle that you can use to collapse it. And if you can put in there who you are, what organization you're coming to us from, and what city and state you're in, that would be a great way to make sure folks have the chat and that it's working. And while people are doing that, I also want to make sure that folks have the questions box. The questions box should be, oh great, we're seeing people, well at least Jalitz was able to use the chat box. If you are only seeing the questions box, which is similar to the chat box with a little white triangle that you can use to collapse, and I'm seeing already a question, are the boxes the same for questions and chat? So it seems like maybe folks are only seeing the questions box and not the chat box. So if all you're seeing are a question, sort of the questions drop down, that's fine. We can use that for today's presentation. And you can go ahead and put the information about sort of who you are. It says questions and chat for participants. How delightful. It's different on our side. So go ahead and use that box for both. Thank you, Simone, for sharing that. And go ahead and put in, yeah, exactly, who you are, where you're coming from, what organization you're with. And I will go ahead and introduce Dr. Batool, who earned her doctoral degree in counseling psychology in 2021 at the University of North Dakota. Her passion for research and advocacy is centered around the issue of forced marriage in the United States and the lack of awareness about this form of harm in the field of mental health. Through her dissertation research, Dr. Batool advocates for reconceptualizing forced marriages beyond race, age, culture, and religion to effectively address serious mental health challenges and stigma against immigrant communities. Her first of its kind study in the US examined the lived experiences of women who were forced to marry between the ages of 10 and 25. And I also just want to say, I don't know if everybody knows this, but Neha and I have been working together for an incredibly long time, and she was an intern with the Forced Marriage Initiative at the Tahirih Justice Center way back when, and I could not be more proud or more excited for her to be presenting with us today. So with that, I'm going to advance us one more slide and launch some poll questions for you all to answer. And we're going to revisit these poll questions at the end of the presentation, but we're going to start with this first question, which I hope people can see, which is, do you believe you have ever served an individual at risk or a survivor of forced marriage in the past or currently? And answers are coming in, and I'll give people just a few more moments to respond. People are really engaging, so that's great. Okay. So in about 3 more seconds, I'm going to close the poll so people can see the responses. And Neha, if you want to unmute yourself and tell me if you can actually see the responses as they're coming in, that would be great.
I cannot see anything.
Okay, so I'm going to close the poll now. Hope everyone has responded. 71% of people have. And let's see if I can share.
Oh, cool.
Can you see the results there?
Yes, I can see it.
Fantastic. So we've got a lot of people, actually more than I've ever seen before on a presentation that we've given, saying yes, they have. So you're in the right place, and I'm really glad you're here. 21% saying no, and 23%, which is pretty typical, around a quarter of folks are just unsure whether or not this is something that they've seen before, and maybe not sure how to ask the right questions or what the warning signs are. So that was very, very useful. I'm excited to revisit that one when we're towards the end of the presentation, and then I'll go ahead and try and launch the next poll for folks, which is, how confident are you in your ability to provide services to someone who might have faced forced marriage or might be currently facing forced marriage? So people are responding. We've got about 35% of folks answering. Okay, we're about over 50% of people responding. This is great. Thank you for engaging, everybody. And we're at 100 attendees now, Dr. Batool, so that's super exciting. All right, I'll wait till it gets to about 75%, and then we'll close and share the results. But if we're stalled out at 66, that's okay. All right, I want to give you time to present, and I think we've got some good data here, so I'll go ahead and close the poll and share. Can you see the results now, Dr. Batool?
Yeah.
Awesome. So we've got a huge room for information sharing and learning today. We've got, close to 30% of folks saying, I'm not confident at all. And then again, you're in the right place. Dr. Batool is going to share some really, really incredible information and insight and guidance with us today. We've got 51% of people saying somewhat confident, which is great. And this will hopefully get you to a place of even more confidence in that space. And then we've got about 15% of people, 16% of people saying they're unsure. So I really, really just want to thank people for engaging with the polls, thanking you for your honesty and your responses. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Batool.
Okay, let's hope I can share it.
Yep, your slides look great.
Okay, perfect. I need to close some windows here. Okay, can you just see the slides or anything else as well?
Just the slides, looks perfect.
Perfect. All right, Well, thank you, Casey, for the introduction, and I really appreciate you all being here today. I wish I could see everyone's faces, but I guess I'll have to be friends with the screen here. So I've spent a lot of time with this research, and it's very close to my heart. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share what I've learned so far and see where we can go from here. So I'm going to start with a very brief overview of what forced marriages are, prevalence rates in the US, reasons they might happen or how impactful they might be for people. I will then dive into my work. It's divided into 3 different sections: experiences before the forced marriage, during, and then after. I will end with implications and recommendations. My hope is that you will walk away with a thorough understanding of what challenges individuals may come across during either of those stages and ways you can support them. This will be opportunity. There will be throughout the presentation some opportunities for you to make comments and ask questions. And another note before I start, the presentation is the same layout as my dissertation. I wanted to keep it consistent in case you would like to look through that later. It is accessible on Google Scholar. It's called The Mental Health Impact of Forced Marriages. All right. So to start us off, I would like to talk about first what forced marriages are. There is some variability in what people perceive them to be. So I would like to clarify the definition that I use for my work. So forced marriage is when both or one or both partners do not or cannot provide free and full consent to the marriage. Absence of consent might be for multiple reasons. It could include lack of perceived choices, being a minor, or when there is subtle or obvious force, fraud, or coercion. I also want to clarify that forced marriages are different from arranged marriages in that families may take the lead in the marriage process, but the ultimate choice stays with the people getting married. And research shows that mostly girls and women experience forced marriages, so it is considered a gender-based form of violence. And for this reason, my research was specifically with women, and they were from any background. In terms of how common forced marriages are in the U.S., I've listed a couple studies here that offer some insight. And the first one was completed in 2011 by the Tahirih Justice Center. 500 agencies from 47 states responded to their survey, and 3,000 cases of known or unsuspected forced marriages were identified that occurred within a period of 2 years. And this was specific to immigrant communities, and 56 countries were represented in terms of the victim's family of origin. Majority were girls and women, but overall not limited to any specific religious or cultural backgrounds. And a more research, a more national survey, not focused on specifically the immigrant communities, they identified 752 individuals with experiences of forced marriage. And this sample also represented multiple ethnic and religious identities. There are a few other studies that I have not included here because of time, but overall it seems that the focus tends to be on immigrant communities. Also here, it's important to note that in between 2000 and 2015, there were over 200,000 minors, majority girls, who were married to older men. And the context specific to forced marriage in this research was not explored, but knowing that younger girls are at higher risk of forced marriage and looking at the dynamics of majority being girls is pretty concerning. So overall, we don't have a lot of studies, but there's enough that tells us that this is something we need to be attending to. Forced marriages can happen for a variety of reasons, including community pressures, cultural or religious values, or prearranged family commitments, emphasis for maintaining honor and reputation. Risks to this may be a sexual identity that parents don't approve of, or a gender identity, fear of promiscuity, preventing pregnancy or westernization. It may also be to strengthen family relationships or address financial concerns if parents are unable to care for their children. Age may also be a factor if parents perceive their child to be getting older, family refusing to accept the partner of choice, or immigration and visa purposes. Let's see. In terms of consequences and how in ways that they're being coerced, due to the forced nature of it, there are multiple forms of violence. It might be just threats or actually happening, and may include subtle pressures like blackmail, manipulation, deception, shame, or it may be more direct in threatening someone's life, abducting, imprisoning, or isolating them until they agree to the marriage. And of course, there are obvious consequences of such experiences. In research, individuals have reported depression, anxiety, trauma, fear, and shame related to health seeking, lack of trust, and social isolation. Those who marry younger are at greater risk for more harm in terms of physical and mental health challenges, and that also includes more challenges for their children when they have them that young. So there will be more details on all of this as I go over my research because it was pretty consistent with what we know so far, and my work added some more to that. So more to come. Some information on why I decided to do what I did. So first, there's not a lot of understanding about forced marriages. Agencies lack assessment and screening tools to identify, and so therefore we don't necessarily know what their needs are and how we can meet those needs. And as I mentioned before, most of what we know is from immigrant communities, which runs the risk of marginalizing them while also neglecting the needs of those who are not immigrants. So there's a lack of clarity regarding the underlying mechanisms, the context of experiences with forced marriage, and the psychological impact. While research has identified symptomology like trauma, depression, and anxiety, but people experience these differently and associate different meanings to such experiences, leading to different types of impact and different styles of coping and help-seeking behaviors, and that's very complex. So we need more depth in being able to provide effective mental health services, especially related to the effect of on the development through developmental periods of their lives since they're happening so young, and the transitioning process of going from one stage to another, from before, during, and the after. That's where we get to the overall experience of it, and then also the nitty-gritty pieces that may not be obvious in more of a survey-based research. There has been more emphasis on experiences before and during the forced marriage, but not as much on the healing process after the forced marriage. So I will be showing that through my research as well. There were, in terms of the research was qualitative, specifically interpretive phenomenology. So this was to really get at the narratives of what people experienced. And what's unique about this is that it looks at what happened, but it also goes deeper to understand how people experience what happened, how did they make sense of it, what factors led to them approaching their situation the way they did, both on individualistic and the systemic level. And so opportunities to look at the overall picture and the depth has been really exciting for me. So I'm going to get started. In terms of the participants, there was quite a bit of variability there. I had 9 women participate. Their current age at the time was in their 20s, the youngest, in the 30s, the oldest. All had left their marriage by the time of the interview. Age at the time of forced marriage was between 13 and 19. Time spent in the forced marriage, the shortest amount of time spent was 2 years. And this was one participant who was forced but went into the marriage knowing that they were going to come out, which is what made it faster for them. And then the longest amount of time spent in the forced marriage was 20 years, and we'll find out what the reasons for that were. And then time since leaving the forced marriage, when I interviewed them, it had been 3 years versus and 30 the longest. So I got a lot of depth of information from very different perspectives. All of them lived in the US at the time of the interview. 2 of them were immigrants, and geographic variability was also quite a bit, but I left it out of here to maintain the confidentiality. A little bit more about their socioeconomic status. I have it separated into before the forced marriage and then after the forced marriage. Lower middle class, lower middle class before the forced marriage were 5 of them, and at the end we see a switch to where 5 of them went into upper middle class, and we'll also see what led to that switch. and then also multiple religious affiliation presented here. In terms of the demographics, 4 identified as white, 5 are biracial or multiracial. I left out the details again for the confidentiality. Employment status here, 7 at the time of the interview, 7 were employed, 4 were self-employed, 2 were studying and working part-time. Relationship status and then sexuality information is also here. All right, so before I begin with the results, I would like to acknowledge that I will be generalizing and giving an overview of what stood out to me within each of the themes in the stories. That does not mean that every single person experienced everything I shared today of those 9 participants. There are so many unique factors that I think need to be at the forefront when we work with our clients. And as I continue, I will share majority of participants experience this, or only a few, or all of them, or just one. So I just wanted to clarify that. And you also might come across things that might be contradictory or may not seem very clear. That is just a reflection of how complex their circumstances were. But of course, please ask for clarification if you get confused. And I have also listed here a lot of quotes because I think that my summarized bullet points don't do justice to the stories that participants shared with me. So hopefully we'll have enough time. If not, then I may be skipping through some of those, and you can come back to the presentation to look through those. No, there was one more slide about the education. Education, consistent education was out of the 9 for only 2 participants. Homeschooling was emphasized for 2 of them with the religious teachings. 5 of them moved in throughout their lives in their childhood, so they were not able to stay at a school long enough to really make progress. All of them stopped education before they were forced to marry. 4 of them started once they got married, and then all 9 of them continued or started once they left the forced marriage. And at the end, when I interviewed at that time, 4 of them had a high school diploma or GED, and 5 of them were in higher education, including undergraduate and graduate degrees. And my results are going to be organized in 3 different sections: experiences prior, during, and after. Each one of those comes with the section comes with the main theme, 3, like for example in the first one, and then each one of those main themes will have two themes. And you will have time to ask questions at the end of each of these stages. And you don't have to memorize this, it will be clear, hopefully. So starting us off with the first one here. So here in the layout, you see the main one here. You see the 2 that go underneath that one. The names of the themes are the same as my dissertation. I did not want to confuse anyone, so it looks the same if you'd like to go back. So the first main one is specific to the environment participants grew up in, the intergenerational trauma and interpersonal dynamics as a result of the trauma and impact on participants' mental health. And starting here with the first sub-theme regarding the family environment, it was described as chaotic and unstable for multiple reasons. Parents were unable to provide physically safe and stable homes, primarily as a result of challenges they had experienced previously in their own lives or were experiencing in the marriage at that time. A few reported financial difficulties, so there was frequent moving, and few reported their parents going through divorce, which exacerbated the challenges with not being able to provide a stable home. And majority of the participants witnessed and or experienced multiple forms of violence in the outside the home and inside the home, which is consistent with previous research. Overall, there was present physical violence, sexual, psychological, and spiritual abuse, and those who perpetrated the abuse included parents, included their parents' partners, step-parents, babysitters, people they met outside, or in general, they experienced bullying by students at school. Here is a table of a summary of information about participants' parents. 6 of them were in abusive marriages. 5 of them had their mental health challenges. These were undiagnosed. For a couple, I think they were diagnosed, but the rest undiagnosed. 3 of them abused substances, which led to increased violence. 3 of their families had significant financial concerns. 2 of the participants' mothers were forced to marry their father. 4 of them, there was a history of within their family and relatives, history of forced marriage. And the community influence for 6 participants, there were community pressure that led to the forced marriage. For the other 3, religious and cultural factors did not influence the forced marriage, and what those factors were, we'll find out in the next upcoming slides. In terms of the childhood experiences, 4 were raised by both biological parents, 3 were raised by biological parent and a step-parent together, and 2 were raised by single biological parent. Another one wasn't there because of divorce or was incarcerated. 2 were in foster care or stayed with relatives, and 5 moved frequently for multiple reasons, as I mentioned before. So the reason I'm sharing this is that this is going to have a very this shows up with a very significant theme coming up. I gotta go back. Okay, so overall, looking at the dynamics of the environment that they grew up in, this led to, for the majority of the participants, feeling like they did not have enough guidance and direction in their life, especially when it came to school, and not being protected from violence. And there were some reasons why only 2 had consistent formal education. This one participant shared that regarding the difficulty with her childhood, she said, I got to the point that I felt like if I stayed in my mom's home, I was going to die. Either somebody was going to kill me or I was going to kill myself, but I just couldn't stay there. So by the time I was 13, I was running away on a pretty regular basis. Another one said, I think my mother probably was bipolar. Whenever I came home, I never knew which version I would get as a young adult. I know she was raped at times. So that really led to the participants not being able to really have a sense of belonging in the house, a sense of power or autonomy in their house. Another thing I want to point out here is that violence was normalized in their households. Part of it was because of the parents had previously experienced trauma and they had gotten used to it. A part of it that there was mental health stigma and that no one had really reached out for help. None of the participants reported reaching out to their parents, looking out for services for mental health specifically. And going back to here, another, the normalization aspect of it, one participant said her stepmother grew up with the generation that the abuse is going to happen. You deal with it when it happens, you don't address it, you don't cry about it, you don't talk about it. Another one said, I do believe that my father also was aware of that sexual abuse. My father abused girls, so how can I expect my father to protect me when he was abusing girls? So these were some of the things that they came across that were developmentally very significantly impactful for them. Now, the second theme here, the fulfilling the voids in their hearts, it goes more in depth with the emotional neglect and its impact on participants' mental health. So there was a lack of emotional support and attentiveness from their caregivers. Also, likely for the reasons described earlier, they described wanting to be loved and cared for, but not experiencing that. Reported a sense of lack of identity, purpose, a lot of confusion regarding family dynamics, given the inconsistencies, and not being able to, a significant effect of not being able to attend to the participants' emotional needs was that it left them vulnerable to future harm by those outside the family. Like, for example, older men came into their lives, gave them attention, made them feel special, and eventually took advantage of them. They were total strangers outside or a babysitter. A few of the participants were forced to marry these men. And another major consequence with violence and emotional neglect at home was that there was no role modeling for healthy attachments to others, which is what led to future repeated unhealthy relationships, which we'll see as we go with to talk about the experiences after the forced marriage. And it sounded like that their perspective of love seemed to have been misguided because they didn't really witness healthy expressions of love. So here's an example of what one participant shared. I would always seek love in other people. I wanted to find a guy that loved me, just show me any kind of affection or emotion. I thought that was love, and I wish that my parents didn't do what they did to me sometimes because I really learned it the hard way. Another one said, I had a void in my heart. I remember constantly really wanting my father's love and approval as a child. Later in life, I married a lot for his approval because anytime I would get engaged and get married, I remember like, see dad, look, I'm doing it right. I'm doing it right, dad, look at me. I was constantly seeking his approval in my adult life. So the lack of nurturing led to some pretty severe consequences. An additional component to the nurturing aspect was for some of them, community culture was emotionally reserved with limited opportunities to create authentic relationships or friendships as well. They described superficial interactions with others. There were concerns of reputation and pressure for perfection and conformity related to the gender norms. So here, one participant said, I love my family, but sometimes it just feels so surface because we weren't able to talk about the hard things. The hard things got us in trouble. Overall issues, personal issues, feelings, emotions were all very much shoved under a rug. Another one shared that there was a lot of love in my family, but it's almost as if they could never really give me the support because they themselves were broken. So even here, even before the themes of religious or traditional practices come in, intergenerationally speaking, a lot has happened within their social context and social locations that is already affecting how they're growing up, how they're thinking of themselves. And what I would like to show here, this is related to the adverse childhood experiences. So the foundation of this is considering intergenerational trauma in the social context, which may create the adverse childhood experiences that affect the cognitive and emotional development, leading to the physical and mental health risks. So adverse childhood experiences were identified through a 10-year study with multiple categories, including sexual, verbal, and physical abuse, family dysfunction, such as substance abuse or mental health difficulties or interpersonal violence, loss of parents through divorce or incarceration. So in that study, if you look at participants' experiences altogether, all of these were present for when participants were young, under the age of 18. And research shows that 4 or more of these experiences lead to a significant increased rate of mental and physical health issues. So, and also then extended this to a more of a community and systemic level, peer rejection, including racism, including low SES, including unsafe neighborhoods, being in foster care, all of that can have even stronger impact and make it difficult to break through the cycle of violence. So this is an area where we don't have a lot of research. This was a significant finding for my work, going beyond the religious and cultural views of how they may affect the process of forced marriage. So now, this is second main theme is going to be about the cultural or religious expectations of girls and women in terms of lifestyle and choices that led to the forced marriage. As I mentioned before, this was relevant to only 6 of the participants. 2 had said that gender socialization was more cultural, but religious was there were religious justifications, and then 2 said that their families were affiliated with the cult. This theme is related to grooming, gender expectations, and power dynamics that contributed to the experience of forced marriage. Regarding this, for the first sub-theme here, gender roles were scripted, often connected with identities and expectations of how participants were meant to live as girls and women. They could engage in only certain behaviors or could only express themselves within limitations. Some families were more strict than others, depending on how strongly they cared for the honor and reputation aspect of things within that community. So overall, formal education, dating, and questioning like the social norms, especially regarding education and marriage, were the most common restrictions that participants experienced. Tasks such as cooking, cleaning, and caring for other family members were encouraged, praised, and taught and role modeled by their mothers and older siblings. I think I have some quotes here, but I think I'm going to skip through those because of time. And I'll just continue here to the explanation. All participants were taken out of school at the time of the forced marriage. Education stopped if they were being homeschooled or they were not enrolled in school or to begin with. Most expressed interest in continuing education and exploring career options, but did not see a choice to do so. And if they did speak up, they were punished or dismissed. For prevention of dating or engaging in sexual activities was one of the main reasons a few participants were forced to marry. A few shared that parents could not take financial responsibility, so they were being passed on to someone else. And then specific to the role of the mothers, participants, their moms lacked power within the family system and were living according to the gender norms as well, without questioning, or if they did question, they were not heard. They were threatened or manipulated. And some moms voiced concerns about forced marriage, but did not seem like they had the influence given the power that their fathers were perceived to have within the family. Regarding internalized gender roles and oppression, what was expected of the participants and how they needed to behave became embedded in how they thought of themselves. So their sense of worthiness was tied to how well they upheld the standards. There was this persona of being a good daughter or a bad daughter, and pressure to be the good one who was submissive and did everything she was told to. The persona of being the good girl was who obliged, and the bad girl who rebelled was very evident, which created identity struggles for some regarding what was expected of them versus what they really wanted to do. So let's see. Regarding the misuse of power in the second part here, this is actually specific to both those where religion was a factor and religion was not a factor. Regarding the power, none of the participants reported a conversation between their family prior to choosing a man for them. Few participants did not even know that they could question their family's decision or if it was forced given the grooming. And in terms of forms of coercion, there was kidnapping until the participant agreed, going to a different state to legally marry because of the age, going to a different country before or immediately after the forced marriage, and families did not give them a heads up. The longest heads up someone I think had was a couple of weeks. There is this one quote that I would like to share here. Okay, the participant who was kidnapped, her father said, "I can't believe you're becoming a bad girl. I'm having you stay. I'm leaving you here because I want you to learn the culture. I want you to learn the importance of who you are, whose daughter you are, where you come from." So the significance of this quote here is that this perspective for me, at least here, seems to reflect really close attachment to his own values and efforts to maintain them with disregard to what she's wanting. So we don't know his side of the story, of course, but possibility that this sense of lack of control in influencing the daughter, her future or harm to his reputation or community could have influenced their wrong behaviors. So as we are exploring, looking more into what is going on for participants, I think this is a significant point that we need to explore more. Overall, fear of increased violence, being disconnected from their bodies or from the reality as a result of the trauma, kept participants from being able to voice their concerns. If they did, the repercussions for going against the norms were social shaming or ostracization, increasing the sense of not belonging and being labeled as rebellious. There was one participant who said that it took her over 11 years to find out that it was not her choice. Okay, so the last one here regarding the experiences before forced marriage, the main one is specifically to the psychological well-being when they were closer to being forced to marry as the time was coming up. So this captures the turmoil, the efforts to cope and reach out for help. In terms of the longing for freedom and survival, participants reported an internal struggle or a sense of fighting, wishing and hoping that marriage wouldn't happen. There was a gut feeling that it was wrong and they wanted to pursue education and a career instead, but a host of overwhelming feelings kept them from speaking up. Some feeling words that I asked them for, they described doubt, fear, confusion, insecurity, guilt, pressure of disappointing their family, fear of going to hell, betrayal, trapped, hopeless, numb. So very, very intense experiences. Uh-oh, did not mean to do that. Okay. Regarding here between a rock and a hard place. So what this signifies is that closer to the time of the marriage, they had mixed feelings about what the experience of forced marriage meant for them. So here I do want to look at the quotes. One participant said, the idea of getting married seemed very welcoming because that was a way out of a very dysfunctional and abusive home where I didn't feel safe. The grooming, that's the part. People have a hard time understanding, like, why couldn't you say no? People tell me you were 19, you were an adult, you had the right to say no. I didn't, yeah, it never occurred to me. That's why. Another participant said, I didn't feel like myself. It's almost like I was looking at somebody else. Like it was happening to somebody else. But I am happy in a way because I thought like, oh, my family is going to be proud of me. And they were proud of me. And like my dad was actually happy that I was like his daughter for once. So I actually think I was actually happy because I just thought it was going to make him proud. So here we have multiple kind of this sense of stuckness. On one hand, marriage means this, but then on the other hand, it's something else. That experience of stuckness was very intense. I don't know how to silent this one. I apologize. Okay, so looking at all of it overall, the key factors that I think are really important to consider is that at this stage, the people are less likely to reach out for support. There are going to be challenges with preventative work here because, especially for fear of consequences, social services were involved for 2 participants, but both of them got in trouble at home, and it never really went anywhere from there. And then the grooming process, some of them really not knowing that this is not okay, and then not being able to trust themselves or others, not knowing that there are resources and being disconnected from themselves. And there are potentially opportunities for interventions at the school level. The participants dropped out, missed classes, or were taken away for a vacation or frequently moving. So those could have been some warning signs that interventions at school can be more targeted towards. And of course, we don't want to generalize here, but this is what stood out in terms of behavioral observations. Also at this level, in terms of helping participants focus on education and awareness is really important. And this is something that can also be done within the schools, focusing on teaching about choice and consent, relationships, resources, forms of coercion. All of that can increase insight and give more choice and autonomy in what they decide. So Casey, I think I'm gonna just go through we'll come back to questions later because of the time. I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So now moving on to during the forced marriage. This is more about dynamics for once it happens, it captures how the violence continued and the intergenerational influence now regarding the participants' kids. So the first one here, silent, obedient, and servant wife, this kind of captures the continuous violence. The sexual violence was there, physical, emotional, verbal, financial. This was more so during than it was before, and then spiritual abuse as well. They described their environment as very controlling, reported death threats, gaslighting, bullying, social shaming, and isolation. They were expected to stay at home, take care of their households, and were kept from continuing or beginning formal education, or were not permitted to question the norms. And with this one, I'm sorry, let me see what's going on here. Okay. No, I don't know where this is coming from. We'll just have to deal with it, I guess.
You're a popular woman, Dr. Batool.
I have no idea. Also, okay, so then I lost where I was. Okay. So part of it overall was what was expected of them, similar to what their experiences were before. And then on the other side, specific to the family pressures, the social norms, submissiveness was rewarded with acceptance of the person and implicitly encouraged. Inconsistency here was, so actually this is, I have to look at this one. This one participant shared, people would say to me like, you're the perfect wife, you're so obedient. When you guys go out, you're just quiet and you let him talk. I was made to feel stupid. It got to the point where I was almost scared to speak up. He's going to correct me in front of everybody and I'm going to feel stupid, so I'll just be quiet. So the significance of this for me is that it wasn't that it was there was direct balance, but it was implicit messages that participants were getting that influenced their internal thought process. Second of the theme here in terms of why don't I feel like I love, this is specific to the participants' children. All of them became pregnant immediately, except one was pregnant before she was married, and then one did not get pregnant at all. They were not allowed to use contraceptives. Pregnancy was expected immediately. So their experiences with pregnancy was, it was different for all of them. But what they had in common was some difficulty in keeping their children safe from physical or psychological violence and in providing emotional nurturing, very similar to how their own parents had struggles. So this is the intergenerational aspect here. And as a result of not having protection, some of their children experienced early behavioral problems and long-term mental health difficulties throughout their adulthood. And regarding emotional nurturing, here one participant shared, I was very emotionally shut down. I would definitely be affectionate with my daughter, but there were times when I would just be emotionally shut down and I couldn't be that playful, like happy mom for her, because I didn't feel like I could do that. I didn't feel like I had enough to give her. So overall, my interpretation of some of these narratives was that cognitively there was an understanding of love and caring for their children, but when they were growing up, they didn't really develop the emotional memories of what love and care feels like so that you can express it. So that was a very critical component that the participants missed out in their own life, and then their children as well missed out. Here, this is the second main theme for during the forced marriage. This reflects the acculturation process to all the new challenges that they were facing with being married, with expectations and raising children. It reflects their emotional experiences as well. So at some point, everyone reached a point when they considered ending their marriage. It varied for everyone. So this theme captures the disappointments, the helplessness after returning empty-handed after multiple attempts to reach out. Here, the first one talks about the efforts to adjust to their married lives. So with this sense of this is not going to end, might last forever, there was this phase where they all tried to adjust, to make the best of it, to be at as much peace as they could find in such a violent experience. So they started to shift their internal process. So here is an example of that. I didn't want to get him angry, so I would try to be perfect. I wanted him to love me and to care for me and to accept me. I didn't talk back, I didn't retaliate, I swallowed it because I think greater for me was the pain of not being accepted, and plus I was pregnant. So they had to start to pick their battles, and cognitive shifts happened as a result of just trying to make sure that they were keeping themselves safe. In terms of the second theme here, the emotional experiences during the forced marriage, even when they were trying to adjust, I asked them what it felt like. And some of the words that they gave me were confused, disappointed, afraid, powerless, resentful, alone, silenced, worthless, doubt, a lot of numbing and shutting down. Everything that happened before went over to experiences during the marriage, and it intensified even more so, because before there was some hope, there was some resistance, some likelihood of it not happening. Now it had happened and they were stuck. So it got much worse. In terms of the very last one here, they all reached the point eventually where they had had enough, and it became so severe that they were worried about their lives, or now they were wanting to attend more to their children, wanting to make sure that their children did not have the life that they did. And so they tried to reach out for help multiple times to families or community leaders, but that didn't really go anywhere because there was a stigma of divorce. And of course, the same expectations continued. Okay, so here's an example of one participant sharing, I'm afraid for my life, I'm afraid for my girls. Can I move in with you temporarily just until I figure out my next step? This was a participant who had gotten death threats and came to her mom for help. And so she said that her response was to turn around and walk out of the room without even answering me. Another participant said, even if I wanted to walk into the domestic violence women's shelter at that point, I wouldn't even be able to because I'm too young. So we get to the last theme, where eventually we did get to a point where they could leave. So the process of that was, first, once they got to a point where there was just no hope whatsoever, they either stopped caring and started doing whatever they wanted to anyway. That was going out to school, learning to drive, going out to work, or they had been in the marriage for so long, they figured out how to navigate the system, how to stay out of trouble. And so they started pretty much outsmarting their families. And so that was the process of them getting exposure with people outside and learning that, oh, there's a different way of life that we weren't aware of. And that validated their experiences that what was happening to them was not okay. One participant, she went to a doctor for the first time after she had a baby. And she said doctors were treating her very respectfully. And she said, I realized how harsh they had for their patients and how much they truly cared. It's also the first time that my voice was valid. It started to empower me as a person. It's the first time that somebody shook my reality and made me realize that there are people on the outside world that are not evil. And here another one said, getting to the point where I realized that this is not living, to feel this daily, this crush, to feel daily like my life means nothing. So it was a combination of them just having had enough, and then also getting positive feedback, positive responses outside of their families, outside of their homes, that where they could start to see some hope again. In terms of breaking through the cage, this is the part where they actually left. There were some internal and external barriers to this. The internal ones was there was a lot of fear of especially going to hell, fear of losing their children, not being able to take care of them, or genuinely believing that their children are going to be worse off if they leave and not have their full, complete family together. External barriers were leaving was a process. They didn't have a lot of resources, especially financial resources. There weren't really anywhere for them to go, no homes, no consistent jobs. A lot of families started to retaliate more as the participants went out and looked for jobs, or went to school or looked for resources. Okay. There's a participant said, I remember waking up that morning like I'm going to ruin my children's life. They will never again go to sleep feeling like their world is whole. They will always, from now on, go to sleep knowing their family is not together, and I'll ruin their dreams that way. So very extreme sense of guilt came with that. One participant had reached out. She left her house, got her own apartment, and she said, the abuser let himself in the middle of the night and he raped me. He would file for 100% custody and try to eliminate my parental rights. Despite telling the court that her abuser was a pedophile, the judge granted him custody. This was the process where, during that process is when the abuser ended up sexually assaulting participant's daughter. So first, there are internal barriers, a lot of overwhelming emotions to work through. And then second, the actual process of leaving was very tedious as well. So some of the key factors for this one, there's going to be much higher likelihood of reaching out for support. Responsibility of children was the greatest factor, and likely participants are going to be reaching out in crisis. I want to point out that exposure here was a key factor with giving them courage and hope to eventually leave. Education, awareness, and social support services, comprehensive services, so that they needed housing, they needed finances, childcare, employment, legal support, mental health services, and vocational interest, especially going to school, was extremely helpful for them. One participant said that education is the first thing that gets taken away from you. So when you can get that back, that's when things start to brighten up a little. Okay, I'm going to skip this one as well and move to the experiences after the forced marriage. So this theme is about adjusting, about the adjusting process once they have left the forced marriage, coping and the help seeking and the healing aspect. So since leaving was a process, so when I say they left the forced marriage, it's not that it was done and over with. There was a long limbo stage, very intense. So for this one, I asked them how they felt when they left and started adjusting on their own. And some of the words they shared was anger, sadness, betrayal, loss, and grief. There was difficulty transitioning to living by themselves as a result of the anxiety, fear, flashbacks, and hypervigilance. They especially struggle with adapting to a different culture because they had never been outside of what was in their homes. They had never had an independent lifestyle. They didn't really know how to interact with others. There was this consistent sense of doing something wrong or hurting other people or making mistakes or other people ending relationships with them. So here, one participant here shared that I felt robbed, like on all levels. I never felt like there was any justice for me or my kids. It was almost like we were just kind of thrown away, like we served whatever purpose that they had for us. Another one, this is the part where some of them entered additional unhealthy relationships. So this participant said, I didn't have the confidence in myself that I could just take care of myself and stand on my own 2 feet. I would try and latch onto someone else who ultimately wouldn't really have my best interest at heart. It was very disrespectful to my own self, but survival. All right, and then moving forward to the next one here in terms of their healing process. So this was also in some ways an exciting time for them, because now they were actually getting the opportunities to explore their identities. This was one participant described that as being a teenager again, because they got to explore their values and feel what the freedom felt like that they wanted before they got married. There was a sense of no longer being someone's property, with a strong sense of resilience, that they had overcome so much, and that they were worth more than what they were told by their abusers. In terms of the process of how healing occurred for them, once shared that mostly by reading books which empower you, which don't drown you in sadness and grief, and instead they uplift, that you have power, that they give you the tools to overcome your struggles or your challenges. So I read a lot, I meditated, and I still do every single morning. Gratitude helped, and I do this with my kids. Regarding specifically the therapy experience, one participant said, hearing her telling me you feel therapist telling me you should feel that way, and it's okay that you feel that way, and it's normal that you feel that way, and anybody in your situation will feel that way, was like 1,000 pounds fell off my back. It was extremely validating. So here, this is the last theme here regarding experiences after the forced marriage. So this is about creating a stronger sense of conviction about who participants were, in their sense of self, meaning and purpose of life that they felt, and attempts to create significant changes for their children, to work through the intergenerational component and make sure that the children did not have the experience that they did. And so this was a result of more education, more career opportunities, stable housing and finances. Their motivation increased, sense of self-efficacy and control increased as well. One participant shared, I'm a grown woman, I have aspirations, I have things that I want to accomplish in my life, and I'm not going to let anybody cheat me out of my own life. I feel very solid in my sense of self. I feel empowered. I feel very confident in who I am today. Another one shared, when I start to feel down about myself or feel like I can't do something, one of my favorite self-affirmation quote is that I walked into the lion's den and I roared back at the lions and I walked out and escaped. That's how I feel most of the time. So you notice here in their quotes, the language here changes, the tone is changing for them. In terms of their children rebuilding the nest. So participants describe their children's mental health struggle and their attempt to help them heal, rough for better life. And although they lacked, at least they felt that they lacked parenting skills, but they learned from their own experiences and did not do everything that their parents did for them, and use that as a guide throughout their children's upbringing. And so this was empowering in finally recognizing that they were doing something different than what was done with them. So it seems that here, one participant said, I want, this was about her children, I want them to learn how to be happy, how to be successful, how to be strong, so that they can do this thing called life. I want my kids to grow up knowing that they always have the power. They have the power to make their own decisions. So instilling different values than what had happened with them. So with the last one here, with the liberation, some participants, they began mentoring others with similar experiences and became more involved in advocacy to give hope. This includes their own, increased their own sense of healing and purpose. The sense that they didn't go through their experience for nothing. They could now use that experience and help someone else, which was very empowering. Here, the one participant shared that I think that's what's so powerful about meeting other survivors and hearing their stories. They're also on the same path that I am. Like as soon as they're free from the situation, they want to go back and free other people. And I think that speaks loudly to that this is an oppression or slavery of some sort that people need to be like almost emancipated from. So this was the exception. They were having a difficult time adjusting when they initially left, but this was an experience, the mentoring aspect, where they did feel connected, and the validation, normalization was one of the most healing aspects of their experiences afterwards. Overall, so summarizing all of it, there is evidence for multiple forms of violence. There is intergenerational influence with especially lack of support from primary caregivers, which then significantly affected their healthy relationships, which then continued to affect the rest of their lives until they got help. And another key point I want to make here is that this was, as we all noticed here, was not an event, it was a process of socialization. The patriarchal values and the misuse of power is there. However, with these dynamics, when they become embedded into everyone's identities and are internalized, and women also become a part of perpetuating violence, at that point, it's not just an issue of power between men and women that needs to be balanced, but that it's also about understanding what maintains the status quo overall at a systemic level, examining the complexities and addressing it with a multidimensional approach, especially in terms of the internalized oppression that may come out. Here, specific to the mental health challenges, there is related to the gender socialization, the self-worth aspect, which was connected to submissiveness. This was the part that led to them not being able to trust their own instincts. And this was one thing that they had to work the hardest when they came out to believe themselves. Looking at the overall internal process of how that shifted and how that helped them, learning to listen to their bodies, trust themselves, creating an identity independent of others' expectations, and also help seeking was connected with all of that and with their level of insight, their level of perceived autonomy and choice, and the shift in the internal dialogue that what they wanted could happen now that they had seen options. In terms of coping, the pattern that I noticed here is that their response was more reactive before and during forced marriage, specifically that being dissociation, hiding, isolating, self-harm. And after the forced marriage, they began learning to manage more effectively with more effective coping skills by reaching out for support, engaging in self-help techniques on their own, more positive experiences, more healthy relationships. So it became more exposure-based, experience-based style. So based on, based on what we know so far, what this means for clinical work in providing mental health services. I want to point out, actually, I want to make sure here that I point out, there were some unique factors about experiences of the two participants who identified as being from immigrant families. There wasn't much data on this, so I don't have a good understanding of it yet. But what I noticed is that they were the only two who were surprised about the forced marriage. Other saw it coming somewhat. They didn't have a heads up, but they saw it coming. Their parents, for these two, they told them that it was going to happen. There were warning signs, but both of them did not believe that it would happen. And they were the only ones who had consistent education, had developed friendships outside of their own community, and had a pretty good idea of wanting to continue education after high school and have a bit of a more thorough understanding. I followed up with them, and both said that they had their own plan for their life, so they didn't see it coming despite being told it was coming. So regarding the surprise element for them, my hypothesis is that they were so identified with their own worldview or had a strong sense of commitment to their aspirations that they didn't really attend to what was being told. They could have also experienced some cognitive dissonance, which is the inconsistencies between their internal and external processing, and it may have been too overwhelming for them to wrap their head around all of it. And then I think it may also have been selective attention, which means that consciously or unconsciously, they may have attended to the part of their lives that felt more comfortable, that they had more control over, while disconnecting from the rest of it because it was too overwhelming. So that's just my professional perspective. There's not a lot of data, so it could be a million of other reasons. But the point being that this is something that we really need to look more into for future work. Now, moving into the contextual aspect and more embodied approaches to mental health, I think it's important to be able to contextualize therapeutic interventions because people may have different needs, even when experiences are similar. With this level of trauma we're seeing, also talk therapy is not enough. They need access to embodied healing, so psychoeducation regarding how their bodies may have responded to the trauma, in what ways their responses may have become automatic. And it's also important to be careful with diagnostic assessments because grief can be overlooked given how ambiguous it can be, especially like, for example, loss of a childhood, and it can be confused with PTSD. Also, we're working with betrayal trauma, which is not something that's often talked about. This is a result, the betrayal trauma is a result of the neglect from primary caregivers. And working through all of this is important because finding the language to express their feelings was also very healing. And so making sure that we are understanding clients where they are at in their process, because as we see with all of those stages, everyone was at different places at different times. And then regarding social justice, overall, I think it's important to assess our systemic resilience, how equipped are we as a society to offer comprehensive services and help them reintegrate once they leave the forced marriage. It's not about individual resiliency. They also need intervention at family level, and given such a heavy impact on their relationships and attachment styles, and how they can all together integrate outside of that. 8 of the participants have reached out for mental health services toward the end of their forced marriage, which was very hopeful when it came to psychoeducation, but only 2 continued long-term process counseling. And some reasons they reported for discontinuing was lack of rapport, not feeling accepted and understood, feeling judged and shamed for being a young mother, or feeling marginalized and alone, and not understanding the point of speaking with a therapist. So regarding a multicultural approach, it may benefit to discuss what therapy is, not just explaining what we think it is, but having it more of a collaborative process with what it needs to be given their worldview. Also, attending to power dynamics, being given choices and feeling respected and validated would be extremely important. Also then focusing on the healing process as well and realistic expectations. There was, I think I may have mentioned this before, toward the end of leaving their forced marriages, when they went to therapists for some education, those who did continue the process part of it, there were existential crises with their entire life having been wasted, and their symptoms got much more severe before they got better. And so no one is going to come to therapy expecting that they're going to get worse. They come to therapy to feel better. So having that transparency in how the healing process may look like and meeting clients where they're at is very important in preventing premature termination. Let's see what else. I think some, okay, so some additional recommendations here regarding self-help resources that we can provide for them, opportunities that have things like brochures outside if they come across anything. I think there were a few participants who just saw some things listed outside in random places that guided them in the right direction. And then this study is the first one that was done in clinical counseling psychology. So there's not a lot of awareness in academia, which I think is very concerning. Most of our education comes from academia. Most of our research that trains us how to be effective therapists comes from that. And I think that moving forward, if you've got any researchers in the audience, that would be very helpful. All right, sorry I had to rush through this. Hope some of it made sense.
No, it was incredible, Dr. Batool. Thank you so much. There's so much rich information here, and so I'm very excited that we'll be able to share the recording and share hopefully a PDF of the PowerPoint slides with folks so they can dive a little bit deeper, especially into those recommendations there at the end, which were really great. So kudos to you. Very, very incredible information that you shared, and we have some really thoughtful questions. What I'd like to do really quickly is to launch the polls now so that we make sure we have the majority of people still on to respond to the same poll questions that we did in the beginning, but reflecting now based on what you heard. Is that okay with you, Neha, to do the polls and then do Q&A?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and I'll launch the, same question as before, but with sort of new context and new information. Okay, well, we're at 50%, a little bit more of folks who have participated, and it looks like we have definitely decreased that unsure number, which is fantastic. And while, of course, we don't want to have survivors of forced marriage anywhere in the United States, the fact that there are more people in this group that now feel more confident in their ability to identify these cases is really, really great to hear. So the impact is already known. Neha, I will close the polls and share the results so you can see them. So already having an impact. And then we'll just do the next one also. Same question as before. How confident are you in your ability? All right, we're close to 50% participation here. And spoiler alert, it is looking good. So we're at 60. I'll close it and I'll share in the interest of time. But we have very few folks who are still not at all confident, and a much larger number of folks who are somewhat confident, and now a pretty good amount of folks who are very confident. So again, really excited to see those numbers shift. And this is obviously just the start of the conversation and the start of like a more robust engagement in this piece of the work to respond to forced marriage in the United States. So really excited even now just to see that shift from just one webinar. So thank you all for participating in the polls. I'm going to start with our earliest questions that came up throughout the presentation. So the first one for you, Dr. Batool, is a question around, do you feel there was any variability or impact in the education level of the individual at risk and the ability of their families or parents to force them into marriage?
That is a difficult one to answer because when they were forced into a marriage, at the time, the education was not consistent for a lot of them. So I don't think I can really answer that. I will say that the two of them who were consistent in getting the education, those had a much stronger understanding of what they wanted for their future. One had said she knew which college she wanted to go to, what she wanted to study. She was a lot more had a lot more sense of conviction in what she wanted. What that allowed her to do was when she entered the marriage, one, she went into the plan of coming out of it. She wasn't going to stay the whole time. And I think she was the only one who also did not try to settle, did not try to make it work because she knew that she was going to come out. So I think it can explain, help with that process, even though they may not have as much control going into it.
Thank you. That's a really interesting reflection. And yeah, I think it's interesting to see in the data that you had was that the majority of folks faced a pausing of their education leading up to the forced marriage, and those things are clearly related and only allowed to restart for some of them after the fact, because denial of education, as we've seen in our work, and please feel free to unmute yourself, is one of those controlling factors that we see time and time again. You cut someone off from their education, and their desire to want to continue it is one of the pressure points of entering the marriage. So another really interesting question that came up in Halitza, again, feel free to join Neha in this conversation, but wondering if any of the participants in this study spoke to having been pregnant prior to the marriage, and the role that, or any themes or shared experiences from folks who might have faced pressure on account of being pregnant prior to marriage, or if that didn't come up with the subjects that you spoke with.
Yes, there was only one participant who was pregnant before the marriage, and that was the reason that the parent ended up forcing them into the marriage. Very direct effect there. I think one of the, if I'm remembering this correctly, one of the participants' mom, stepmom's son had raped the participant, and so there was some worry that that may have been found out, which led to them wanting to cover it and then forcing it to marry whoever the person was available so they could rush through that process.
Yeah, I think we have absolutely seen that in our work in Halitza. I see you've unmuted, so go ahead and feel free to share some reflections here too.
Thank you so much for your reflection, Dr. Batool. It has been our experience with some of the survivors we have worked with that they have been raped, become pregnant as a result of the rape, and the family, the parents, whoever the community is, finding that the girl or woman is pregnant is what then pushes for a marriage to occur to quote unquote fix the situation. And that may be by marrying the perpetrator, regardless if there was, you know, an age difference, regardless if it would be statutory rape or not, or marrying someone who would again just quote unquote make the situation right.
Mm-hmm. I also want to add with one of the participants, she has started dating, and her mom found out, who told the father, and then the father married her within the next 2 weeks, I think, because he was worried that something might happen from there.
Yeah, and I think, you know, another piece of this question that I don't want to ignore was, you know, the participant, and it's Leanne, so thank you for the question, commenting that forced marriage of youth who become pregnant is driven by cultural and religious influences locally where they are working. And I think I just wanted to reflect that I have seen in our work at Tahirih, both with survivors and in terms of responses from legislators when we're seeking to address child marriage on the state level, is that this question of should teenagers who are pregnant be allowed to marry comes up time and time again, and strong feelings about that comes up from every background. Folks from all religious walks of life, from all cultures, multi-generational Americans, you know, first-generation Americans, you name it. There is a strongly embedded belief around pregnancy and marriage in this country that sort of stretches across communities and cultures that we've seen. So it's definitely playing a role. One other question, well, there's several, but another good one is from Carter. I'm wondering if the survivors Dr. Batool interviewed shared if they are still in contact with their families.
Some of them are in contact with their family. I think majority of them were in contact. It was not great contact with all of them. It was most of it was actually their family still pressuring them to come back. Their family is still trying to kind of guide how they want the participants to live. So very strained relationships. or some they cannot avoid, like if the partner did have a custody, then they have to share, go back and forth, but not a closed relationships, not close connections to where they go out and eat meals together. They did not have, this was one of the reasons I had asked. I was wanting to know more about what might have happened on the families and what their perspectives were like, and if participants had any idea of the motivations for the family, and they did not have any information other than just kind of guessing what that might have been based on their experience.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think this final question is related to that one, which is, when these survivors get divorced, did they find it difficult to re-enter their communities without being harassed or shamed? And it feels like you may have touched on that a bit already, but if there were attempts at re-entry or maintaining relationships, how did that go? Did they reflect on those experiences at all?
Yes, it was, there were not really any successful attempts. A couple of them went back out of obligation. When there were certain family gatherings, they went back just to be a part of the family for reputation and for honor again, but there was harassment still ongoing there. With those two, at least. There was one who had been just, I can't think of the word, who was no longer allowed to come back to the family.
So that experience of being sort of fully shunned or estranged from your family. And I think, you know, we've got 2 minutes left, and we've got one more question that has just come through. But I just did want to reflect on, you know, as you have shared, addressing the impact of forced marriage across the lifespan and the experiences is multi-layered, it's multidimensional. It's related to oppression and racism and xenophobia. It's related to intergenerational trauma. It's related to interpersonal trauma. And that estrangement piece is a huge component often of, like, if I don't belong in my family and I'm struggling to find my way in this new world, where do I belong? Who am I? What is my identity? That identity rebuilding comes up a lot in our work too. And I'm glad that more folks now will have this guidance of how important exploring that is and supporting someone on that journey is. And so the last question that has come up here is, did any other women have the opportunity to work with did any of the folks who engaged with mental health engage with a provider who spoke their native language, if English was not their native language?
For all of them, English was the native language. That did not come up. That's a great question.
Yeah, and Laurel, I see you asked a follow-up question similarly related. Did they have the opportunity to work with peer support specialists and others who spoke their native language? And it sounds like if they were working with those groups, they were speaking English, because even for the folks who came, participated in the study, English was their first language despite their background.
Yes.
Okay. But I think that is a really interesting question. And I think we know, and Halitz can surely speak to this, that there are lots of folks who are facing this form of harm that English is not their first language. And I think there was a participant, Neelam from API Chaya, who shared that they have a special curriculum on cultivating positive family relationships, and includes positive parenting practices. And that Neelam would be happy to share that with you and connect with you on that. And I think, yes, it will be important always to put mental health care in the context of that individual's background, and as much as possible explore what they want. I think both Halitz and I have worked with folks who really want to engage with providers and community supports that reflect their cultural background. And then there are folks who don't feel comfortable with that and would prefer to work with someone from outside of their community. And so it's always sort of just a consent-based conversation. What is most comfortable for you? Where would you like to engage, and trying to find those resources. Even though right now they are still quite limited, we are trying to grow them, both in culturally specific spaces and in more mainstream spaces, so that both feel welcoming and healing for folks, and then people have options. So any final words from you, Neha, before we sign off and say congratulations on an incredible piece of research, an incredible dissertation, and an incredible contribution to the field?
I would just like to add that I'm very grateful for the participants that participated in my study. It was amazing and so inspiring to hear their stories. And because of that, we know so much more than we did before. And I appreciate you all for taking your time to be here today, because this is very important, as you can tell.
Fantastic. So if it's okay with you, Neha, the participants have asked for your contact information. If you're comfortable sharing that, I can put it into the chat before we sign off.
Yeah, go for it. Okay.
Why don't you read it to me so I don't navigate away and somehow lose our webinar? It's at neha.batool@und.edu. Okay. So I'll leave that up so that folks will have a chance to write it down, and we'll certainly share it in the evaluation form. We can put it right there at the top for anyone who signed off early and didn't get it. Otherwise, I think we can go ahead and sign off, and I hope everyone has a great weekend. And thank you so much again, Neha. This was incredible. All right, bye everybody.